Thank you. Just to correct on that a little bit, I'm mainly, my work is focused on investigating U.S. intervention in Venezuela. We can axe the entertainment law thing from there. And also the book was actually written in English, not translated into English. I wrote both my books in English first. They were actually translated into Spanish and in several other languages, French, German, Italian, Polish, Russian. They're interested in these issues around the world. Anyway, just to correct that. So just to add a little bit on to what Steve was saying regarding the change in relation between Venezuela and the United States, I would add to the fact that obviously Venezuela played a key role in reviving OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, around 1999-2000, which of course caused a lot of reaction from the United States, the price of oil going up, which we see today is over now $100 a barrel. But two other factors I think played a key role in changing the relationship. One being President Chavez's public opposition to the expansion of NAFTA into the Americas, the creation of the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement, which at the time, 1999-2000, the Bush administration was pretty sure. Are the lights going out? Yes, someone's leaning on the lights there. I was pretty sure it was the CIA. No, I'm just kidding. Again. At that time period, the Bush administration was really positive that they were going to pass the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement. In fact, many of their own documents that we've now obtained under the Freedom of Information Act make that clear. Not just relating to Venezuela, but also relating obviously to Colombia, to Bolivia, to other countries in the hemisphere. So that was one of the main factors, in addition to the role in OPEC, that caused the United States to take issue and say, wait a minute, we're going to change this wait and see policy that John Maisto maintained during the Clinton administration to become one more of, well, maybe we should worry about this guy and what's happening down in Venezuela. The other factor, of course, being the new constitution that was ratified. You guys have already heard all those stories over the past couple of days, by the people of Venezuela in 1999. And of course, with the new constitution, new articles, new laws, new rights, legislation had to be enacted in order to implement those rights. And we had a new hydrocarbons law that began to redistribute the oil wealth, actually make the private companies that had joint ventures in Venezuela pay taxes and things like that and royalties that they weren't doing before Chavez, before the revolution. And other factors, land reform laws and different things taking place in the country that caused, the U.S. to sort of start to look at Venezuela with a raised brow and say, wait a minute, what's happening there? But in the beginning, what the United States did was act in accordance with their traditional allies in the country, which, before Chavez, Venezuela maintained great political, social, economic, and cultural ties with the United States, and many of those that were in power before were either puppets or allies, had close relationships with the U.S. government. And so those were the ones that the U.S. government turned to when they needed someone in Venezuela to help implement some kind of policy or, coup, we got to that, something that would take care of this issue of Chavez, and this revolution taking place. And so one of the main areas, I classify U.S. intervention in Venezuela into three different areas. The first one of those that we'll briefly talk about because we don't have that much time is the financial front of attack, I call it, or financial angle, where the U.S. has been intervening in Venezuela. What they did initially around that time period, precisely 2000, the year 2000, was to begin to fund political parties and NGOs and those organizations that were their traditional allies. We're talking about, Acción Democrática, COPE, even to help create new parties, younger parties with youthful faces, fresher faces, because people in Venezuela were sick and tired of the old parties, like Primero Justicia, that came onto the scene around that time period, 2000, 2001, and as we now know from the investigative work using the Freedom of Information Act, many of those new parties were actually formed with your taxpayer dollars and with strategic advice from people in this country through different institutions. So that was the first way that the United States began to intervene into Venezuela during the Chavez era to try to destabilize the revolution and the Chavez government. How many of you, obviously this is a well-informed crowd, how many of you have heard of the National Endowment for Democracy? Well, that's good. Boo. What about USAID, United States Agency for International Development? Oh, that's good. How many of you have read the Chávez Code? Just to know, that's okay. You don't have to be embarrassed. I'm not, no one's going to get reprimanded. Okay. Just to give just for those who don't know, because about 70% of you said you know what the National Endowment for Democracy is, created by congressional legislation in 1983 as an entity that would be private, which is completely contradictory to be created by congressional legislation and to be funded with public funds, U.S. taxpayer dollars, through Congress, approved in the appropriations budget each year by Congress, and then supervised by the Department of State and its representative in the country where the entity is acting, which would be the ambassador of the United States in that country. So looking at Venezuela, the case of the National Endowment for Democracy, they began in 2000 to increase the funding to these traditional allies of the United States. And to make a brief story short, because obviously we can't get into all of that here, and I recommend you read the Chávez Code because if you haven't, because it does go into detail about exactly how that entity, the National Endowment for Democracy, was used to help build up the opposition to Chavez initially in 2000 to 2001, and then that those were the entities that came together and formed this coalition that by 2002, was leading the efforts to overthrow Chavez. Of course, it wasn't just exclusively, these are what they call civil society groups. There was also interference in and aiding, advising, and financial help also to other sectors, military sectors, for example, at that time period. And then in this civil society realm, we include the political parties, the NGOs, the labor unions, the Chamber of Commerce in Venezuela, Fede Cámaras, and also the media, which we all know heavily involved. All of you know about the coup, right? We don't have to get into any of that. So we know that the National Endowment for Democracy funded the groups involved in the coup. We know that after the coup, they actually increased the funding to those groups that had executed the coup against Chavez. So we know that the National Endowment for Democracy, which in its own legislation, as Congress created it, its mission is a noble mission of promoting democracy around the world. So we know we could say that overthrowing a democratically elected president via coup would not be classified as promoting democracy, correct? Yeah. In any case, they continued to fund these same groups and increase the amounts they were receiving. And just months later, the other entity that I already asked you about, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, set up their Office for Transition Initiatives in Venezuela. This OTI, as we call them, they are rapid response teams to political crisis. And in the case of Venezuela, at that time period, after the coup, well, we didn't really need an Office for Transition Initiatives. The people had taken care of the transition back to democracy and constitutional law and bringing the president back. But in any case, the United States government set this office up. It was supposed to be a quick, rapid response team. They usually are 2 years in and out, take care of the problem, and they're out of there. But in the case of Venezuela, it's the only OTI that is actually still remaining in a country beyond its initial time period. So now we're looking at 2008. That's not 2 years. This is now 6 years. 6 years that this OTI has been operating in Venezuela. One of the reasons why this is the entity that's still operating with approximately a $5 million budget a year of your taxpayer dollars, or those of you who are paying taxes in the United States. One of the reasons why the OTI is the representative of USAID operating in Venezuela is because Venezuela does not have a bilateral cooperation agreement with USAID, as, for example, Bolivia does, which is another country severely subjected to U.S. intervention through these same mechanisms. In the case of Bolivia, just to make the comparison, they have an official agreement with the United States government and with USAID to receive humanitarian and infrastructure aid and different types of aid that go, even democracy, some democracy stuff, but that's supposed to go towards really helping things in the country, whereas they've now, under Evo Morales, in the case of Bolivia, been diverting those funds to the separatism efforts underway by the opposition to Evo in Bolivia. But in the case of Venezuela, we don't have any of that stuff. We just have the OTI, which is dedicated entirely to feeding the political conflict. That's what they do with the money. And it's literally as easy as filling out a form that you can download from their website online if you're a Venezuelan organization. As long as you have an address and a name, you can get $50,000 from the OTI to feed the conflict in Venezuela. Just so you know, that's where your money's going, instead of going to healthcare and other things here in the United States where it should go, housing.